Got
and
it. Let me
I
do
will edit as needed. So I'll just do the
Just
I'll
in
just
case.
do the intro as I
Sure.
do normally. Okay. So
Okay.
hi everybody and welcome to episode 166 of Circle Up and Get Real, where by now you know we talk about things that matter with people who matter. And today my friend Brad Szollose is my guest. And Brad, we go way back in a lot of ways, don't we?
We do. I mean, I think we're pushing on 2 decades now.
No, really?
I don't want to talk about age, but yeah, I think we're pushing 2000. Oh, maybe it's been 1 decade, like 2013.
Yeah.
Don
Yeah,
introduced that.
2013. Oh,
Yeah.
it seems like forever.
I
But
know.
Brad is the mastermind behind my logo for this show. And Brad is a graphic designer who does amazing work,
Thanks.
among many other things. He is an author. He is a TEDx coach. He is an expert in millennials, and
Mhm.
he does work with millennial generational people in the workplace.
Yeah.
And I'm just reading from your website, Brad, whether it's leadership lessons for a new workforce, cross-generational management strategies that work, or better hiring practices, organizations rely on Brad to modernize their approach to people management and leadership development to dramatically increase output and ROI. So, well, we'll pick a lane. I mean, we could be in a lot of different lanes for this conversation, but welcome.
Thank you. What I love about us is we can talk about any subject, and we were just a minute ago in the green room, and you and I bring a sense of I want to hear the other side of the story, and there isn't this emotional charge that goes on, and I think that takes time to develop emotional intelligence. And I can honestly say I did not have any emotional intelligence 30, 40 years ago.
You probably
Zero,
had a
zero,
little. Let's
zero.
hope.
No, zero. And then I had to learn, I had to learn. So that's
That's
it.
the good thing about emotional intelligence. It's not like your IQ. You actually can develop emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And I guess you would want to do that before, you take that journey. And I think we were talking earlier about the way the world is changing around us, and whether or
Yeah.
not we want to be part of the change, or whether we want to dig our heels in and stay where we've been.
Yeah.
And emotional intelligence would be one place where, what was it that had you decide you wanted to get smarter in that area?
A lot of people know this, but I took my 4th company public back in the 90s. It was a .com company. And I got to tell you, Jody, the stress that I had, I took a management class at NYU on top of everything else that was going on in my life. I was married. I was helping raise 2 adopted kids, and going to work and working probably 90 hours a week. I mean, it was insane. As a matter of fact, when I went to my doctor, I go to a naturopathic doctor, and he says, I have good news and bad news. He says, the bad news is you have the internal organs of an 85-year-old man because of stress.
Wow.
And when I took this class at NYU, we took a stress test, and everybody's hand kind of dropped when they hit about the 120 mark, and I was still up at the 420 mark, 430 mark.
Wow.
He goes, how in the hell are you not dead? I mean, he
Yeah.
literally wanted to know. And I said, because I meditate.
Mm.
And that did help. But back then, I mean, I would snap at the simplest thing, because the stress level, my nervous system was strung as tight, as a harp. It's like, ugh. And I snapped one day at my CEO, who I hired and groomed, and he went to the Wharton School of Business, and he said, Brad, do you want to be known as the guy who snaps over little tiny things and we can't approach you? Or do you want to be known as the leader that's approachable? And he goes, and I'll help you do that. And so that began my journey of, okay, maybe to be a better leader, I'm going to have to, it's not about me, I'm going to have to shut that off, that, hey, I'm an entrepreneur. I started this company. turn that down, turn that
Mhm.
burner down,
Mhm.
and begin to see the bigger picture. And so through the years, this is the weird part. I mean, I went to Landmark. For those of you who know what Landmark is, it's the spinoff of EST training, and reprogram me a little bit, help me to be able to write a book, years later, to stand up and be a leader in my community. That was step one, deprogramming.
Mhm.
I really truly believe that Landmark Forum, I took that first class and the second one,
Mhm.
Landmark in Action, deprogrammed me along with my spiritual work, which was, meditation and dream writing. And I'll go there right now. Out of body
Mhm.
experiences, working with dreams and other spiritual masters, sitting with them, listening, and contemplating, and just going deeper and deeper into my work. And through the years, because I had a rough childhood, not rough in the sense that, I was abused, but
Mhm.
my mother was bipolar and my father was that first generation of Hungarian immigrant who didn't care about my feelings. He
Mhm.
just wanted it done. Okay.
Mhm.
So I was mowing the lawn at 10, like,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you're both your hands up in the air over your head, pushing a lawnmower, which can be dangerous and horrifying to today's parents.
Yeah.
But that's what we did. My dad showed me how to do it without getting injured. But emotionally, he wasn't there. And my dad could also be um, not distant. I mean, we had that European style of upbringing. I kissed my parents goodnight every night. My father treated me like a man when I got to be 18. I was given little bits of responsibility, but there was a lot of things that probably could have, in today's generation, put me in a counselor's office.
Mm.
So I was overcoming a lot of that through the years. I've done DISC training,
Mhm.
DISC, behavioral training and communication. And then on the more esoteric side, I've also done peyote and ayahuasca. So
But
how's that for being real?
no, that's great because all of that is uncovering things you don't know,
Yeah.
to use again landmark terminology. Both you and I have done that. And how would we possibly be able to do better if we didn't know better?
It's very true. I mean, our blind spots to me are the most fascinating part about this work. It's like, okay, I just hit 60. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, okay, I'm still working on stuff and still finding my blind spots. And my girlfriend works with eutaptics, which was created by Robert Smith, which is, tapping
Oh, mhm.
along the medians to release trauma that's in the brain, emotional stuck energy, traumas, things like this. And I'm learning a little bit about it, so I may not have gotten the terminology right, but as you're tapping, and this was discovered by a doctor who was working on a woman who was deathly afraid of the water,
Mm.
like wouldn't go near it, wouldn't, go swimming, wouldn't do anything. And he goes, well, where do you feel this fear? And she goes, in the pit of my stomach. So he knew about the acupuncture lines and
Mhm.
the different pressure points, and he had her just tap right under the eye, which is for the stomach area,
Mm.
and it released. And she went swimming that day for 4 or 5 hours. This is a woman
Wow.
who's petrified of the water.
Mhm.
So Robert Smith, through the years, he's taken other courses and invented his own style of eutaptics, or faster EFT, it's called.
Mhm.
And so now I'm working on, you release the things that make you react or deflect or get what's triggering you, and you tap those out. You focus on the memories and the pain. You may not even know what the memories are. You just focus on where you're stuck in your body emotionally. You feel in your heart, your chest, maybe your throat, and then you tap through and it releases it. It's astounding
Huh.
how that works. So that's another level I'm talking
So
about.
I'm curious about those kinds of things because I really believe in so many things I didn't know not that long ago. And I'm curious, Brad, what your take would be on those people in our lives who seem to be addicted to being stuck. Even though there are a lot of things they could do to release some of those phobias and fears, they choose not to. I'm curious if you have a take on that.
Sure. And I'm one of those people who can be that. I can get stuck in those areas because I believe, if a good friend dies, I believe in the mourning process. I mourn and I stay in that and I listen to sad music and finally I step up one day and I go out in the sunshine and I go, I'm going to miss him. Love you, buddy. And I keep going. So I can get stuck in that. But like last night, there was a really great moment. My girlfriend, Tal, she pointed out to me, because she's studying to be a eutaptics practitioner. She goes, can you let go of this hurt that you have right now? Because it was the kind of hurt where it's like, it was completely 100% justified why I felt the way I did. You know, and I'm standing here like Superman. I'm justified, in my pain. Okay. You don't know the pain I went through. It's worse than your pain. That kind of tape is running in her head. And I think what happens is human beings are really easily programmable. Okay. So our pain becomes an addiction, our justification of why we feel that way. We can glom onto that and say, well, it's justified and I don't have to move from here because she did this to me or he did that to me. And we can easily sit there and say, well, that's why the relationship ended, you know, and stand in that might of that and that righteousness of it, and that I'm right. And to get healthy emotionally, especially, we have to have the strength to look at that differently and say, why am I holding on to that? Is that interfering with my joy? Is that interfering with me being able to make money, to get up and go get a job, let's say? Because we can sit in that and feel proud that we're in pain. We can feel proud that we didn't cheat, they cheated. You know, I'm just using a story. Or that, you know, I'm normal and my mother's not. You know, we can sit in those and feel self-righteous and not move. It's very easy to not move.
Right.
You know, and I am embarrassingly going to share, you know, last night I got into a little argument with my girlfriend, and she helped me through it because I was riding on triggered emotions from the past. And we got to tap a little, let go of that, find a new narrative to step out of that hole I was in. And even me, somebody who's spent, you know, we're talking 40 years of self-help, therapy, doing alternative ways of release, things like that. I'm still working on these things. And
how long did it take you, Brad, from the time you recognized her saying, hey, do you want to get rid of this, till you actually did it?
Well, because we're doing the work, I recognized it right away, because she's helping to point it out, as we do with our significant other. But man, I resisted probably for about an hour or two.
Okay, so an hour or two.
I wanted to sulk.
I get it. And again, I don't want anybody who's listening to this to believe that, you know, happy talk and Pollyanna and sunshine and roses is the only way to be, because it's not reality. That's not being real. When you recognized and you said an hour or so, it's not lifetimes and generations and decades that it's taking you now. You said, I've been working on this for 40 years. Yes, this is an uncovering of things, right? But when people recognize, because to me, that's the most important part, is when you start recognizing your pain or your stuckness. And
why you're in pain.
And why you're in pain. Well,
you may not know.
What if you don't know?
Well, this is the power I've found of eutaptics. And I hate to sit there and say, you know, just get this book, you know.
I know, right?
But eutaptics, the first time Tal showed me eutaptics, we were talking 2 years ago, she had me tap through something and I was stuck. The energy was so stuck I couldn't breathe. Do you ever have that, folks? If you're listening, you know, you can't breathe. I tapped and I yawned and I released and I got this huge intake of air and I went, what the hell just happened? And I realized, you know, those years of sitting in a therapist chair, you know, doing Gestalt therapy and being angry constantly, it released. I was like, whoa, this guy's onto something, this, you know, this particular practice. And those of you who are listening, this is called shadow work. You know, we talk about this on my podcast, you know, Awakened Nation. And I started to realize, Jody, this is incredibly powerful. A lot of people join a spiritual group or they do yoga, or they meditate, to push all that stuff to the side. And they kind of pretend they're one with the universe, but here's this whole sack of stuff behind them that they're not facing. Not everybody does that, but I'm just saying. And this is why you see, some guru is sleeping with all the women, in the ashram or whatever, or you see someone, their temper snaps one day and they just do something that you're like, whoa, that's so out of context. Because those dark shadow parts of us, we have to embrace them and pull them in and focus on them and look at them and love them, and work through the trauma of it.
Yeah.
This whole just be positive is nonsense, because it's putting these things off to the side, and you will have to deal with them later. And on a side note, my ex-wife, she's a nurse, and she used to tell me, when she would do hospice. And she would tell me, once these people reached a certain point where death was, right there, the true dark self came through. And my ex-wife is Black, and they would call her horrible names. Yeah. And she wouldn't react because she knew this was the dark part coming up, or my mom, and when she was getting close to death, a lot of that sexual repression that she had lived with now came out. A lot of those angry parts that she suppressed because she was a good Christian, I put that in quotes. That came out. Her mouth, she had no filter at some point. And this is what happens when you don't do the work and you don't deal with the work. And my father being a chiropractor, I noticed something too. You see, when we store anger in our body and we don't release it, we get curvature of the spine. Your spine begins to curve. So you see these people are hunched over, and they're only like 65 sometimes. They're filled with that anger that they didn't deal with. Life doesn't always turn out the way we want it to, but we can make lemonade, as they say. But the anger stores in our body, in the liver especially. And then our bones start to get a certain way. So maybe this will give you, some of you are listening, incentive to do the work, because it will show up physically.
What's really funny, I mean, the physical, by the time it shows up physically, that you're at later stages of awareness, I think. And when you recognize that disease,
yeah, that's what
it's dis-ease. And so part of this, I mean, I know you can call it, wacky talk or woo-woo, whatever you want, but here's the deal, everybody. What do you choose? You have choice in the matter.
Right.
And what is it that you're choosing? And that, to me, is what it means to be real, radical, energized, authentic, and learning focused. And when we get into that space, awareness dawns on us, and sometimes it clangs in our ears. It kind of just depends. So you alluded, Brad, to your podcast, Awakened Nation. Would you talk a little bit more about that? Because this is a really important podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jody. I have been a guest or a host on over 100 podcasts when I first published my first book, which was Liquid Leadership. And I got tired of that same conversation. Like you, I yearned for that deeper, real conversation. And I just got tired. It was always the same conversation on business shows. I'm successful. Do you want to hear how successful I am? And I would just go, ugh. And I would push, I'm kind of intuitive. So I would ask deeper questions. And then it was one day, Tony Wroblewski asked me to be a guest with two other people, Ben Gay III and Jim Palmer, the newsletter guru. And I got on this podcast, and Ben just opened up about the death of his son, how it crushed him, and he still had to go to work. And then Jim, he started talking about, he got fired from a job he had for years, and he got diagnosed with skin cancer in the same week. And then he couldn't find a job. He was forced to become an entrepreneur. He was working at Target. This is a guy who was on the fast track to executiveship, wound up working at Target. And for 18 months, he didn't have a single client. He goes, I'm an entrepreneur and I don't have any clients, period. And I sat there and I thought to myself, this is the conversation I want to have. And so years later, everybody goes, "You should have a podcast, man. You should have a podcast." And I sat down with my ex-business partner, and we did a whiteboard session. And she goes, "So you want to do a podcast?" And I said, "Yeah, but I want it to be deeper conversations. I want to get into the extraordinary. I want to be able to interview people who've had out of body experiences, or went and did ayahuasca, or were abducted by aliens." I wanted to have the business entrepreneur conversation that no one else wanted to have, where the guy lost his legs and still was able to become this brilliant leader in the community. I wanted real conversations from outliers, entrepreneurs, shamans, spiritualists, people in all walks of life. So Awakened Nation came out of that. And basically the premise is, I interview people who've been knocked down mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or physically. And from that moment on, they had to live their life differently. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, it's a big, rewarding creative outlet for me, because I get to interview people. Like, I just had Geraldine Orozco on for the second time. We're in our 5th season now. Geraldine claimed to have been impregnated 4 times and came to almost full term with children that were alien hybrids. And I know that sounds, out there, but the reason I had her on the show is she was on a documentary where they regressed her hypnotically, and she explained each pregnancy. And her uncle was her first gynecologist, and he had all the sonograms of the children, that first child. And so I go, I want to get this person's take, even though it can sound like it's crazy, because I believe in some of this. Some of this is happening on Earth. They're reporting certain things. Then I had another guest on, Dove Barron. I think you also know Dove. Dove fell 120 feet to his death and broke every bone in his body, and lived, and had to hike for 2 hours out of this, forest area to get to a helicopter. And when he was lifted out, the doctors looked at the x-rays and they said, "How did he get from the mountain to the helicopter pad?" And they said, "He walked." They said, no, that's impossible. And we talked about his worst moment. I've had Panache Desai on. He's a New York Times bestseller, who's kind of like a spiritual guru in England and around the world. He got on and talked about just giving up and shedding his whole life from before, because he was trying to fit into a world that didn't want him. He was from India, and he was living in Britain during the punk rock movement, and he was trying to be cool and hip and be a DJ. And he realized it's not my path, he said. And so I get a chance on the show to really interview people like I've had Dan Millman on, who,
I know that one. I love Dan Millman so much.
Dan was incredible. He wrote The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. I have Dog the Bounty Hunter. I am interviewing him tomorrow.
Wow.
With his wife. We're going to talk about some spiritual stuff there. And my buddy Chris Salem, he asked to be on the show. And this probably gets to the heart of it, because you've been on the show as well. He asked to be on the show, and I usually don't put friends on the show unless they're doing something amazing like you. And I said, "Well, Chris, I'd love to have you on the show, but I hope you're ready to talk about your alcoholism." And he goes, "Absolutely." He goes, "It's the foundation of my work, but we're also going to talk about my heroin addiction, my sex addiction, my anger management issues, my relationship with my father." And I went, "You're the perfect guest, baby." Wow. Because I don't want to have those surface conversations. I don't want to read your press release and that's the same thing we're interviewing.
Right.
I want to take the tagline is a deep dive into the extraordinary. And that's exactly what I want to do.
Yeah.
I want to ask that person, well, what do you really believe in? The guy who took me on my ayahuasca journey, Bearheart, I had to interview him because he was such a powerful presence. Here's a guy who was basically a strong arm assassin for, several biker gangs, white supremacists, a Mexican cartel. And after his daughter was born, he said, I can't do this. I'm going to be dead before she's, 5 years old. He got out. Therapy wasn't his journey. Ayahuasca was, and it cleared the trauma out of him. He's done 1,000 of these things, and he is such a light, in the forest. It's just powerful to see. those are the conversations I'd like to have. Like it's getting real. Get real.
Right. Well, and I think what I love so much about that is the awareness that, again, dawns on us, or is a clanging alarm, that allows us to see the world so much more broadly than we could if we were stuck in one ideology or one way of seeing things, which I think we've kind of fallen into recently, at least in the United States. We pick a side and we don't really look beyond that, it seems.
Well, I like to get to the side of the story that no one's talking about. I think it was a season 1, we had Leela Singh on, and she's a transgender person who really laid clear what the whole transgender movement was. And we're talking 4 years ago, I had her on the show. So now we're in the middle of all this chaos that's happening, because you have one side resisting, one side that's fighting. We have chaos everywhere. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But we also, our emotional intelligence is very low as a nation. The United States is really in their teen years as a nation. You look back at Italy, that's a 4,000-year-old, nation. We're 250 some odd years old, 260 years old, and we're coming out of our teen years for the first time.
Yeah.
And we're fighting amongst ourselves. We're fighting. And the only thing I can tell people is, I was thinking about this the other day. If you're in Japan, it's because you're Japanese. If you're in Germany, it's because you're German. If you're in the United States, it's because your ancestors packed that up, and got the H out of there because of the rape, pillaging, plundering, and murdering of your family. The Hungarian side of my family came to the United States in the 1920s to escape communism, because I guess my great uncle got shot in the head by the communists because he was the police chief. And so people come to America because they're from all over. So it used to be, if you had your own enclave, everybody let you alone, you be your own enclave, but you integrated into American society. You learned American. And that is the great part of America. We are a melting pot of everything. And whether it's LGBTQ, whether you're a Hungarian immigrant's kid, whether you're Black, a Latino, Asian, my girlfriend's from Vietnam, we came here for a better life. And we need to be reminded of that. We are a melting pot of everybody. There is no right or wrong. There is an American way. There is an American patriotism, and it isn't always surrounded by Christian right, and it isn't always about the liberal left either. Right. It's really about helping to get along in a society that is the greatest experiment that's ever happened. That is the one thing about America that makes it a great experiment. We are from everywhere.
I think we forget that. I think I've been reminded of that just recently too. I had a guy in my podcast maybe a month ago now, who reminded me of where I live in North Dakota. My ancestors came looking for a place that was similar to what they had left in Germany and Scandinavia. And then when they got here, they hunkered down and said, we're done. This is it. And then stayed. And this guest was reminding me that back in the old country where people came from, they had to adjust because things were shifting around them. They learned new languages. They learned new cultures. We didn't. We indoctrinated ourselves into the place we landed, at least in my part of the world. And we are not the most open-minded people.
Yeah. I remember I went to art school for art and design. And I remember after the first couple of semesters, I came back, and it's a winter, and I have a long coat on. It's well designed, and I have cowboy boots. And at my local mall, people just stared and pointed. That's how I grew up. Okay, they were like, "Look at that guy. Who does he think he is?"
So where did you grow up, and where did you go to school?
I grew up in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. My family was originally from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which is an old Civil War town. My grandfather owned a restaurant/bar down there called Hottie's Cottage. It is called The Cottage today. But I went to high school at Lebanon Senior High. I went to Lebanon Harding Elementary School, and also Lebanon Junior High. And so from 6 years of age, I also went to St. Mary's Catholic school from 6 to about I guess I was 10. And so I was a drummer. I was taking drum lessons, and um, yeah, I loved my upbringing. We had people from everywhere, all walks of life. Because of my last name, the Hungarian last name, I got to hang out with a lot of Greek kids, and we would play and then go to somebody's restaurant because,
That's
there's
what you
always a
do.
Greek restaurant somewhere, or a diner.
So
Um,
then and then when you went to college, where was that?
I went to the Institute of Pittsburgh, and that was a great experience because I wanted, I could have gone to Temple University. This is back before having a 4-year degree was the biggest thing in the world. I could have gone to Temple University. I was accepted, and I chose the Art Institute of Pittsburgh because I wanted to be out in the world working as a graphic designer, or what they used to call a commercial artist back then. And so I got my associate's degree there, and I learned how to illustrate and draw and do advertising art and illustration and you name it. And I did really well in anatomy class. We had college, anatomy, because my dad being a chiropractor, I grew up with all the charts on the wall and all the graphs. And the first project my dad made me do when I was a kid was I had to put together the Visible Man. You remember that?
Yeah.
I had to put that together and paint all the organs. So I'm
Wow.
well aware of the nerve endings,
Wow.
things like that. And so when I got to college, it was just such a great experience because I was around other artists and people who thought like me. And then I got my first job in New York City and packed my portfolio up and moved to New York City and lived there for 35 years. And I accidentally fell into a niche part of the design industry, which is corporate meetings. I was doing those, and we're not talking like, we're going to sit in a room with 75 people. We're talking ballroom size, sometimes stadiums. I had to design the graphics for the backgrounds up on the jumbotrons or,
Wow.
60-foot screens. So we were making them animate, and we were doing them with slides back then. When I first started, we were doing board art and slides. So I had to create these crazy special effects. I'll give you a good example of what it is. One time we had to do Gillette. I was working for a studio called Carabiner. I was freelance for many years. And we were doing this big launch for Gillette was doing, I think, the sensor blade at the time. So we received these giant models of the blade, and the handle and everything. And the reason we got giant models is you cannot photograph tiny little plastic pieces because they get scratches on them. So you have to have these giant, full size models. They're 8 times the size of the original. Well, what happened is they had done The Best a Man Can Get, that song, with a full orchestra in 8 different languages. And while they were programming the show, we had to hear this constantly for hours. I was so tired of hearing it. The best a man can get. You're like, I'm ready. We would leave for lunch. We were known for working during lunch. We would leave because it was driving us crazy. But we were doing all these graphics and animation to introduce this brand new sensor razor with 4 blades, but here's what happened. All the salespeople and the reps and all these people who represented Gillette, we took them to a stadium in the dark, and they had to walk through this long tube to get into the stadium. And when they came into the lighted stadium, they looked around and they sat down. Well, here, the tube they had just walked through was a giant sensor razor handle with the blade at the top, with the orchestra sitting there. And the CEO would come out and give a speech, and they would play The Best a Man Can Get, and someone would sing it in all these languages. So, on the stadium wall, we had all these graphics and animation and modules, as they called them, where they would do a little excerpts of piece. So this is the kind of work I've been doing for probably 40 years. I've worked for every pharmaceutical company there is. Also car companies. We did a lot for Lincoln Mercury and Ford, Mercedes-Benz, BMW. You name it. I've done work for Roche Pharmaceuticals, Boehringer Ingelheim, you name it.
Wow. So the reason I asked all that is because Lebanon, Pennsylvania, Catholic school, who you were growing up with a chiropractor father,
Mhm.
going back with your long coat and your cowboy boots and having people point at you. When you find your people, you found your people, art, design, drumming, the things that made you found your
Yeah.
people. And when you
Oh, yeah.
tried to bring your new self back to your old place, how could it have been any different for you when the people you were coming back to hadn't left?
Well, you know what's funny? Friends are friends. It doesn't matter, if you part ways. I have the same best friend since I was 12 years old to this day.
Hmm.
And I remember when I went to take the martial arts, I was in my 40s. Okay, I was 45 when I said, "Hey, I'm going to do some hardcore, martial arts." He goes, "Oh yeah, okay, that's cool." And I said, "How come you're not more excited?" He goes, "I thought you would do this sooner."
Oh,
He
wow.
just is always on board. Dieter, shout out to Dieter Hauer.
Hmm.
But in a small town, I was already known as sort of the weird kid, because I'm an artist, I'm a drummer. I do my own thing. I was always going to the beat of my own drummer. And so I wasn't bothered by people pointing at me and doing all that because I just I can be snarky. I have a smart mouth, so I know how to defend myself. But people go along with it from my generation. The people who were probably pointing their fingers and laughing were much older.
Hmm.
They're like, what's going on there? My generation, we're the cusp baby boomers. We were so tired of the racism and the race riots and the Vietnam and all this stuff that we kind of didn't care. We bonded together, didn't matter. Um, you know, uh, when I went to see Blazing Saddles, this is a good example. All my friends were Latino and black, and a couple of us were German and white Americans. It was a mix.
Yeah.
Um, and that might sound unheard of to go see Blazing Saddles, but we laughed so damn
Mhm.
hard because it was mocking
Yeah.
the crap our parents
Yeah.
were into,
Yeah.
that racism and that casual racism, and we rejected it, and they turned it into a comedy. So that'll give you an idea. But um, you
So
know, it,
that then sort of brings us to, well, there's a lot more we could talk about that got
yeah.
you
But
here.
to wrap that up, I basically I never tried to fit in because I couldn't fit in.
Yeah.
I was either the drum line was probably the closest place I fit in, and then the art department. And there were a couple of us. We were all kind of weird outcasts. John Gusty, another shout out to a buddy of mine. We had our own paintings in our opposite corners, and he would come by and he'd look at me and he'd make a joke. He'd go, "Szollose," he just I go Gusty, we'd laugh because we were competing. He did a lot of paintings that were similar to mine. I was more into science fiction. He was into fantasy. So when you're a kid, that's what you paint.
Mhm.
So I found my tribes and I
Mhm.
stuck with those tribes, and I didn't really care what other people thought. I could get along with anybody. That's the weird part. Football team, I could have them cracking up in seconds. And they admire drummers. That was the weird part. You think you join band, you're going to get beat up. If you have a pair of drumsticks, they're like, "Hey, Solace is cool, man." So it's like, it's the weirdest paradigm. So
Well, and so where you are now and what you're doing now, you said you've sold 4 companies, you got into tech,
yeah.
you have learned about millennials when millennials were young. You were
Well,
writing
yeah.
about liquid leadership.
Well, what happened is I pinch myself every day with this journey. Uh, I've always been an entrepreneur. So my first business was at 16, and it was with a couple of buddies of mine. We were doing, disco was popular. So we had a traveling discotheque, Disco Enterprise was the name of the company.
Wow.
And so I learned basic, profit and loss. But then when I went to New York City, I went freelance. I tried to start a company with a buddy of mine. That didn't work. It fell through, and I was just very frustrated. So I was hanging out with a buddy of mine who I'd known in college who also had moved to New York City. And him and his wife, they lived near me in Queens. And he invited me one night to have dinner and meet a client of his. And I remember every detail. This is the funniest part about this. We went to the Japonais maison, which is Japanese house, and that's in French. And so it was French. It was the first time I went to a mashup restaurant where they fused French culinary standards with Japanese food. Incredibly delicious. And I got to meet one of his clients, Harvey, and we get in the car later and we're about to drive back. He was going to drop me off at my house. And he says, "Hey, I want to start a business with you."
Mm.
And I looked at him and I was so burnt from businesses. I said, "Well, how about if you write down about, 3 reasons why? Because I'm really not in the mood to have a business partner, Doug."
Mhm.
And so we went home and, he and I, we were part of the Mutual Admiration Society when it came to design, because I would show him some of my slides and, some of the things I was doing in the doing corporate events and experiential design. And he would show me the work he was doing when it came to logos and print work, because he was working with a high-end print house that did a lot of the hotel chains in New York City, the high-end ones like the Ritz-Carlton,
Mm.
which had to be laid out in multiple languages and things like that. He would show me some of his work. And I remember he was showing me some of the stuff he was working on with Apple computers. And for about 3 years ago, "What do you think of this?" I go, "Still not as good as our handwork. What do you think of this?" And he goes, "It's still not." And then one day he showed me something. I went, "Oh, I better get a computer."
Mm. Mm.
And so about 2 years after that, he says, "Let's start a business." And I said, "Okay." And we were sitting around in my house naming it. And I wanted to start something big by the time I hit 30. So it was February of that year, 93. And we came up with the name K2 because he and I like to go skiing and mountain climbing and stuff like that. And so we just got an office, didn't think it through. Everything was accidental.
Mm.
Got an office. It was $750 a month for like a 16 by 12 office space. We renovated it with his what's we call it, his brother-in-law came in and helped us. And then we just started getting clients based on, our, background of 10 years in the industries that we were in. So our first accounts were like American Express and Banco Popular and things like that. And then after about a year, we realized we weren't making enough money. And he comes in one day and he says, "We have to become an internet company." And I'm like, "What the hell's the internet?"
Mm-hmm.
Back in 94. And we sent out a postcard. You're going to love this. We sent out a postcard, bought a mailing list, and a postcard mailer back then used to get about 4% return. We got about an 11% return
Wow.
on that, including someone knocked on our door who was a floor below us. They had a server farm, which we didn't even know what the hell a server farm
Yeah.
was back then. And we started doing graphical user interface design for like Sierra Magazine for them.
Wow.
But as we started to grow, we wound up in advertising age one day. And that's when we exploded.
Mm-hmm.
Our pictures are right there. But I started to notice that this next generation, and this was Gen X and some very would the first round of millennials, let's say, that were telling me off in my own company. And I'm like, what in the hell is going on? Is there something in the drinking water? I literally was like dumbfounded, because they were not acting like previous
Mm.
generations. Even my CEO, that was only 3 years younger than me, he was like an alien. He would
Mm.
do things and we're like, what are you doing? And it was really because they had grown up in the digital world. That was number one. And the other thing is parenting had changed. And so while I'm working in this chaos and building a company and taking it public, I kept thinking in the back of my head, I got to write about this someday. I got to write a book and explain why this is happening. And then years later, after I left the company and we got bought out by a much bigger company, I decided to write Liquid Leadership. And I went back and I wrote down basically all the experiences I went through. And then I started to do the research, like what were the big shifts? Now, a lot of generational people will tell you, well, it was 9/11 and it was the war and it was all that. No, none of that changed their
Mm.
behavior. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I'm talking little tiny shifts in behavioral communication took place, and it started in 1984. Now, we got a taste of it in 1977, which was video games came into the household. And people love to argue with me on this, but they stop arguing when I pull out a GAF Viewmaster.
Yeah.
And I go, this was the most interactive thing that a baby boomer could use. And then right around 1984, this is what the next generation started to use, because Sega and Nintendo came into the household. Well, guess what? It changes your brain. It changes the way your brain forms. And something else that people don't realize is two other things were a big influence. Parenting changed. Now the hierarchy in the household, shut up, sit down, listen. Now that shifted to parents were like, hey, Billy, what kind of sport do you want to take? You know, instead of being pushed into something. So the hierarchy flattened inside the household. And then when they got to college, the hierarchy in the school system, everything was flattened too. Now they were encouraged to call their teacher Bev. Hey, Bev, I don't want to do math today. You know, this dynamic changed. There was no longer authoritarianism in the classroom. And then we were shocked when they went into the corporate world and they walked up to the CEO and they say, hey, Chet, I'm going to show you how to run this place because I just got my master's degree in business. Meanwhile, Chet has built the company since World War II. So that's one. The second thing is our gravitation to different types of movies shifted right at 1977. When Star Wars came out, if you look at the top blockbusters from that moment on, they are either fantasy or science fiction driven. So Harry Potter, Marvel, the Terminator movies, Back to the Future, they're all science fiction based. They're all fantasy based. Before that, we watched Westerns and romantic comedies and things like that. After 1977, everything shifted and changed. And parenting, the other big thing that happened in parenting, I always like to do this in my keynotes. I will pick someone out in the audience and I said, the conversation shifted from get the hell up and work on the yard. It's 10 o'clock on a Saturday. The conversation shifted to Billy, I'm sorry we woke you up. You can stay in bed, but your mom and dad, we have a question for you. Should we get a divorce? And so now this communication changed in the household where instead of the parents telling you to shut up, sit down, shut up and listen was the old paradigm, shifted to, hey, you don't leave. You stay in this house as long as you want. See that new car in the driveway? We bought that for you. Brand new off the lot. Yeah. And mommy and daddy, we're not getting along. So what do you think? Should we get a divorce? You know, because all the specialists, the psychologists, starting with Carl Rogers and Dr. Spock, told you this is what you're supposed to do with your kids. And so we see the result today. So everything shifted. And I discovered this while I'm writing Liquid Leadership. And I had to put it in the book, even though it's a business book. I have parents reading it.
Wow.
And calling me up and saying, could you help me talk to my 6-year-old? Because I show them the influence.
Yeah.
You know, when you give a child a voice, they grow up to be an adult with a voice. And so sometimes they don't know their place in an organization. Sometimes they don't realize they need to be patient. Sometimes they don't, they see us who have been working for 45 some odd years and can't understand why it took us so long to get to our position, and they're going to do it sooner. And they believe they should be paid as much as you and I should be paid.
Yeah.
And so we created this, by the way.
Right. Well, and I'm betting that the more you look at it, the more you could see trends that probably are going to come back around again. It's not anything new. This is probably similar to what in the 50s, you know.
Who was it? Aristotle said, you know, today's kids are, you know, they're mouthy. They won't shut up. You know, they talk during dinner. You know, it's always been an issue. The next generation has always been an issue. But I think the pendulum will always swing back to conservatism, and then it swings back to being a little more, you know, liberal, and then back to it just goes back and forth. That's all it is. That's life.
Yeah.
You know, and we can sit there and say, whoa, what the heck? Because studies have found that now millennials as parents, they're a little more strict than their boomer parents who said, you can do anything you want, Billy. You know, they're a little more strict. So the pendulum is swinging back.
Right,
So
right.
yeah.
So I guess my in the moral of this story might be, when the pendulum swings back and settles in the middle, let's just hope that the middle is higher than it was when it started, so that
Yeah.
when we find that place where there is common ground at some
Yeah.
point, it will be through conversations like this.
I agree. I mean, if you look back, let's just go back 50 years. If you went to your parents and you said, "Hey, I'm gay," or "I'm lesbian," you'd probably get disowned. But
Mhm,
today we have parents who are like, "I love you.
mhm.
We're going to take care of you. We're going to get you through this. And I look so forward to being at your wedding, walking you down the
Right,
aisle." And they're
right.
not as upset
Mhm.
by stuff that, they shouldn't be,
Yeah. Well, and I think it does come down to understanding, even if you can't understand it, then
Yeah,
acceptance,
right.
and being willing to treat humans as humans, and not just in a business
W-
sense as the resources that they've become.
Wait a minute. Are you talking about humanity?
That's a whole other conversation we
I,
can
you
have
know,
next time.
I had Stephen M.R. Covey on the show.
Yeah.
And I actually asked him, I said, the workplace has changed. The human beings have changed. The training has changed. The barrier to entry to start your own company has changed. And leadership has not changed because you're still teaching at the top levels. If you don't like it, just fire that person. And
Mhm.
they don't realize you just fired the reason your 7-Eleven is making $4 million while the rest are making maybe $1 million.
Right.
That person you fired was the reason people went there.
Mhm.
They just, these are the disconnects that drive me crazy.
And keep us in business, Brad. That's why we still do what we do when we both hit 60.
Ain't it the truth? It is the
And
truth.
yeah. So, Brad, if people wanted to get a hold of you, what are you looking for now as it relates to business? Is it coaching? Is it helping people get on the TEDx stage, which I know you were doing? What is it that you're looking to grow in yourself?
What I do business wise, I did a TED talk myself, and just because I did the TED talk, people would reach out and they'd start going, "Hey, can you help me with mine?" And that turned into a business. But what I'm really doing now is I take people who want to be thought leaders, and I either help them get their book written, or I push them to get on television, or we craft their image, how they're going to step out into the world, just like I did. If you do a Google search of me, I'm in Forbes magazine and Inc. mag. How did I do that? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So I teach that and show them and push them and help them get to where they are right now, because it's celebrity branding, it's image consulting, things like that. Because if I can do it, you can do it, let's put it that way. But it takes media training, so you stop saying and
Mhm. Mhm.
you know what I
Mhm.
mean, right?
Mhm.
Those kind of things. uh
Like,
like
oh, like I'm hearing
like
so much and it's driving me crazy.
short story. I got a friend on a show, and she, I'm guest hosting with the other host, and she's saying, like she must have done it 30, 40 times. I had to text her and tell her to stop. She's in California and I'm in New York. I said, "Stop saying, and you said it 30 times already."
Oh.
But yeah, I'm getting some of that work. And then here's the best fun. Some of my clients I've actually put on my show just because they have an
Mm.
interesting story.
Mhm.
I don't put everybody on my show, but I always like to have that quirky conversation that makes people lean in. So
Yeah.
um uh I'm building my audience right now for my podcast, because I want to do that full time at some
Mhm.
point, get paid. Um, you know, I've had friends who've gotten some lucrative contracts to host their podcast on someone's platform. And I'm hoping to do that. So I'm just building my audience right now.
Well, if you want to hear more from or about Brad, go to his website, bradzollos.com, and that's
Mhm.
SZOLLOSE.com. How else, Brad, would they find you? I know
They
you're
can just
on YouTube.
Google, yeah, they can Google liquid leadership,
Okay.
awakened nation. That's past tense, as if you've awakened.
Mhm.
Awakened nation. You can look for that. We're on all the platforms now: Apple, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Google. Spotify. We're everywhere. We're even on, I was surprised at this. I'm on Amazon Prime and Audible as well.
Wow.
Yeah. And the podcast, we are in our season 5 and we are at episode, I think we're at 108 at this point.
Nice.
We have lined up, as I said before, we have Dog the Bounty Hunter, we have
Yeah.
Stephen M.R. Covey, and hopefully, this is a big guest I'm trying to get, Erin Barakovich.
Oh, wow.
She said she'd do the show. We just have to schedule it, and that's it.
Nice.
So yeah, we're getting
So,
some great talent.
oh,
We got to have
well,
you back on too.
I'll come back on. That was a fun well, it's always a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Brad, thank you so much for taking
Thank
the
you.
time to be with us today, and reach out to Brad, get on his podcast, get his podcast on your listening list. And as always, go get real. Talk to you again.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you for having me on.
You
Bye-bye,
bet.
everybody.
Bye.